Salam alaikum. Mega mutar tagul ko tosho. Vale?
Sergeant Kinley? Hey, JJ, meet your new junior.
Hey, I'm JJ.
Introduce him to the boys.
Understood. It's Ahmed, sir.
Well, it's Sergeant, not sir. You got
These goddamn apples, Joe.
I wouldn't normally bother you with issues like this, sir, but you're the only one to get anything done around here.
Man, what's the problem?
We keep going out and achieving nothing. I keep putting my men in constant danger.
That's him. That's Faraj.
Pretty much, yes. Give him some lube.
Yeah, welcome back, mate.
He has a lead. Understood.
I apologize.
Welcome to the Cineflux. There are films that arrive in the world quietly, without fanfare or ceremony, and ask something of you before you even settle into your seat. They ask whether you believe that a promise made in a place most people will never see still carries the full weight of a human life. They ask whether loyalty can exist between two people who were never supposed to be equals. And they ask, somewhere underneath everything else, whether the stories that come back from war ever tell us the whole truth about what was left behind. Tonight we are sitting with one of those films. A film about a soldier and a man who saved him. About a debt that travels across oceans. About what it means to owe someone everything and arrive home anyway. This is not a comfortable film and it is not trying to be, but there's something in it. Something specific and human that I have not been able to let go of since I first watched it. And that is exactly the kind of film the Cineflux exists to explore. So pull close, let the world outside go quiet for a little while, We are going somewhere that matters. Let us begin before the film. Let us begin in the world that made it necessary. On the 14th of August in 2021, the last operational American forces departed Afghanistan, ending a military presence that had stretched across 2 decades, 2 generations of soldiers, and an incalculable weight of human consequence. The images that followed that withdrawal, the desperate crowds at Kabul airport, the people clinging to aircraft, the chaos and the grief circulated around the world and produced a specific, searing kind of shame that political language was not quite equipped to process. Because what those images showed was not just the end of a military campaign, what they showed was abandonment. The deliberate or bureaucratic or catastrophically mismanaged abandonment of thousands of Afghan men and women who had staked their lives on a promise that, in the end, the American government did not keep. Among the most acutely vulnerable in those weeks were the interpreters. The local Afghans who had worked alongside American and coalition forces for years, sometimes for a decade or more, serving as translators, as cultural bridges, as people whose intimate knowledge of language and landscape had on countless occasions been the difference between a mission succeeding and a soldier dying. These were people who had taken sides, people who had made themselves visible to enemies who had very long memories and very little mercy. And when the withdrawal came, a significant number of them were still waiting for the special immigrant visas they had been promised, still caught in a system that had processed their applications with the urgency of a bureaucratic formality rather than the urgency of a human life at risk. Many did not make it out. The full weight of what that means has never been fully absorbed by public consciousness because some stories are too complicated for the news cycle and too painful for comfortable consumption. Into this moral and historical wound, Ritchie's film arrived in April of 2023, and what it chose to do, rather than describe the political machinery of failure, rather than examine the policy landscape or assign institutional blame, was something far more intimate. It chose to look at two people, one American soldier and one Afghan interpreter. It chose to ask not what the system did, but what two human beings did for each other when the system had already made its decision. That choice is the most interesting thing about this film before you even press play, because it positions the Afghan interpreter crisis not as a political event to be analyzed, but as a human experience to be felt. And in 2023, when war fatigue and the rush of new global crises had already begun to move Afghanistan to the margins of public attention and that felt like a genuinely intentional act, the war film as a genre had been in a complicated place in the years leading up to this film's release. The prestige wave of Afghanistan and Iraq narratives, the films that had come out in the 2000s and early 2010s, carrying the raw, unprocessed urgency of conflicts that were still happening, had largely subsided by the mid 2020s. What replaced it was a more reflective mode. Finns that were less interested in the heroics of combat and more interested in what combat does to the interior of a person. Films that found their moral weight not in the battlefield, but in the aftermath, the silence that follows, the damage that does not show up on any scan but lives inside every room the soldier walks into when they come home. This film sits at an interesting intersection of both instincts. It has the kinetic pulse and the tactical urgency of the combat drama, but it is also, and this is the part that drew me in, a film about death, about the weight of a life owed, about what you do with the knowledge that another human being risked everything to carry you out of a valley when they had every reason to leave you there. Critically, the film's reception was something worth examining. When it opened, it earned a warm response from a portion of critics who responded to its sincerity and its performances, particularly the work of its Afghan lead, which we will come to shortly. But it was also met with a degree of skepticism that had everything to do with who directed it. Guy Ritchie's name on a war film raised genuine questions in certain quarters. Questions about whether the sensibility that built his reputation was the right sensibility for this material. Some of those questions turned out to be fair, some turned out to be less so. And the gap between what this film was assumed to be and what it actually is, that gap is part of the reason we are here tonight. At the box office, the film underperformed relative to its reported budget. It did not become the kind of theatrical event that generates cultural momentum. But what happened after its theatrical run is its own story. On streaming, where it found the audience that had perhaps been put off by the theatrical timing, or by the marketing, or by the simple unpredictability of where attention lands in any given month, it developed a genuine and growing following. Word of mouth from people who had actually watched it began to accumulate. Viewers who had expected a conventional action film found something quieter and more serious underneath. And the performances, particularly one specific performance, started to gather the kind of quiet recognition that comes when an audience discovers something the award season had largely bypassed. That is the texture of this film's life in the world. It did not arrive triumphantly. It arrived carefully, found its way to the people who needed to see it and settled into them, the way a film about loyalty and death should settle. Slowly, with weight and without fanfare. Does it feel timeless? That is the question I keep turning over, and the honest answer is partly the specific political and moral context that gives this film its urgency. The interpreter crisis, the special immigrant visa backlog, the faces behind that failure, those details are particular to a very specific historical moment. But the emotional architecture underneath them, the question of what we owe each other when the system has already turned away, that question does not belong to any one war or any one decade. It belongs to every moment in which human beings find themselves bound to each other by an act of grace they never asked for and may never be able to repay. That question is ancient. That question is now. And that is why, despite its flaws, and we will be honest about those, this film stays with you in ways that pure entertainment rarely does. So let us come to the film itself. Guy Ritchie's The Covenant, released in April of 2023, directed by Guy Ritchie, and carrying the full weight of his name as both a promise and a complication. The film stars Jake Gyllenhaal as United States Army Sergeant John Kinley, a man commanding a unit in Afghanistan whose interpreter position is filled partway through the film by an Afghan man named Ahmed, played by Danish Iraqi actor Dar Salim, who brings to the role something that the film would simply not work without. What kind of film is this? On its surface, it is a war thriller with a survival spine. There is tactical combat. There is the dangerous textured geography of Afghanistan rendered through location shooting that we will discuss more closely later. There are firefights and ambushes and the particular kind of tension that comes from knowing that the threat can arrive from any direction at any moment. If you arrived hoping for that experience, this film will give it to you. But here's the thing about this film. The thing I need to say clearly before anything else. It is not primarily about combat at all. It is about what comes after combat, about what we carry home, about the gap between the life that was saved and the life that did the saving, and the impossible distance between those two people that no government form and no flight manifest and no political will seems able to close. At its heart, this is a story about a promise. Not a spoken promise, or at least not the kind that gets written down and signed, but a promise of the oldest kind, the kind that exists between two people who looked at each other in the worst possible moment and chose to act toward each other as human beings rather than as strategic assets in someone else's larger calculation. John Kinley is a man with a family to return to. Ahmed is a man with everything to lose and a reason for being there that we come to understand gradually, in layers, and that reframes everything we thought we knew about his choices. Between them, something forms that neither word, friendship, nor loyalty, nor brotherhood quite captures. What forms between them is a debt, and debt, in the deepest sense, is not something you discharge. It is something you carry, and carrying it changes you. Guy Ritchie directing this material is genuinely a surprising proposition. The director who gave us the kinetic pleasure of Lock, Stock and Two Smoking Barrels, who made crime comedy feel like a visual style all its own, who brought a propulsive energy to Sherlock Holmes and a particular kind of muscular spectacle to his latest studio work. That sensibility does not, on first reading, feel like the right instrument for a story that requires stillness, moral weight, and the kind of restraint that lets an audience feel the gravity of what it is watching without being told how to feel. And here is where the criticism of his direction has some genuine traction. There are moments in this film where you can feel his instincts pulling in a direction the material does not need. Moments where the style asserts itself slightly ahead of the feeling. We will be honest about those moments when we come to them. But there are also moments, and these surprised me more than I expected, where his direction is exactly right, where his eye for physical space and his ability to create a sense of place through texture and light and movement serves the story without commentary, where the visual energy he brings to action sequences serves not as spectacle but as expression, as the translation of fear and urgency and desperation into something the body feels rather than the mind processes. Those moments exist in this film, they are real, and they are part of why this conversation is worth having. Jake Gyllenhaal brings to Sergeant Kinley what he brings to almost everything he does, an intelligent, internally pressurized performance that rarely takes the path of least emotional resistance. This is not a heroic soldier in the conventional mode. He is competent, precise, and carried by a quiet sense of duty. But he is also a man whose interior life the film initially keeps at a careful distance, which is a choice, a deliberate and interesting choice that we will sit with more fully later. What Gyllenhaal does with that distance, and what happens to it as the film progresses, is the American half of this film's emotional argument. And then there is Dar Salim, and everything about this film changes when you look clearly at what he brings to Ahmed. This is a performance of remarkable economy and depth, a performance that communicates an entire interior world, the history, the grief, the intelligence, the calculation, the code of honor that makes Ahmed do what he does without the film ever finding a comfortable way to explain him. Ahmed is not a supporting character. He is not a grateful local who helps the American hero. He is, and I mean this with full precision, the moral center of this film, the person whose choices carry the greatest weight and whose story carries the greatest cost. Dar Salim inhabits that without sentimentality, without performance in the surface sense, and with a presence that is, this is the word, earned. Should you watch this film? Here is what I will tell you before we go any further into it. If you come to this film expecting a conventional war movie, you will get something more complicated than that expectation prepared you for. If you come to it with curiosity about what the experience of the Afghan interpreter crisis looked and felt like at the level of individual human lives, you will find something genuine here, even if imperfect. If you come to it for the performances, if you are the kind of watcher who knows that a film can be worth your time for a single performance alone, then Dar Salim's work here is reason enough. And if you come to it with an open question in your heart about what loyalty actually demands of us when the institution we trusted has already left the room, then this film, for all its unevenness, will have something to say to you. It is not a masterpiece, I will tell you that honestly now, before we go any further. The rating I arrived at after sitting with it, 6.2 out of 10, reflects a film that does something genuinely valuable and does parts of it very well, but also a film that carries compromises and missed opportunities that a different version of itself might have avoided. That is the honest accounting we will arrive at together. But here is what I also believe. A 6.2 is not dismissal. A 6.2 can be profound respect for what a film is trying to do, combined with equal honesty about the places it fell short, and that is precisely the kind of conversation the scene flux exists to have. So let us go deeper. Let us go inside. There is a particular kind of experience that comes with sitting down to a film when you already have a fully formed expectation of what it is going to be. Not hope, not curiosity, expectation. The settled, almost contractual certainty that you know what you have bought a ticket for. And the more clearly defined the director's identity is in your mind, the more powerfully that expectation operates before a single frame appears on screen. I had spent enough time with Ritchie's work to have built that expectation very precisely. I knew the energy, the cut rhythm, the way his camera moved with a kind of impatient intelligence, always looking for the angle that would make you feel the scene rather than just observe it. The verbal crackle, the overlapping momentum of his storytelling. I knew what a Ritchie film felt like, the way you know the weight of a familiar object in your hand. And so, when I sat down with The Covenant for the first time, what I brought into the room with me was not entirely fair to the film. I came with the weight of all his previous work pressing gently but firmly on what I was about to see. I was primed for a certain kind of cinematic energy, and the film, almost immediately, began the quiet work of asking me to let that expectation go. The opening of this film does not announce itself with the urgency you might expect. There is no propulsive cold open designed to tell you that something important is already underway. Instead, what the film gives you in its earliest minutes is something more unsettling and more unsettling, and a texture of routine. The daily operational grind of military life in a conflict that had, by the time this film is set, been running for so long that even the danger had begun to feel like administrative procedure. Kinley and his unit move through their days with the practiced efficiency of people who have been doing this long enough to stop asking why. There is professionalism everywhere. There is alertness. But underneath both of those things, there is also something that the film communicates without ever naming directly, the specific fatigue of people who are very good at something that is slowly becoming unclear in its purpose. The opening minutes of this film are doing important work that it would be easy to undervalue on a first watch. They are establishing the moral and emotional baseline from which everything else will depart. Before we can understand what Ahmed's choice costs him, we need to understand the world he is choosing within. Before we can feel the weight of Kinley's death, we need to understand the man who is going to carry it. And so the film takes its time with the texture of the work before it shows us the fracture that will split it open. That patience, that deliberate willingness to let the atmosphere accumulate before the drama arrives, was the first thing that told me this film was interested in something more than the surface of its genre. The landscape itself rolled out as something I had not entirely prepared myself for. Afghanistan as rendered in this film, and we will talk later about the remarkable production circumstance that produced these images, carries a weight and a particularity that refuses to become merely decorative. The terrain is vast and indifferent, full of the kind of geological scale that makes human conflict feel both urgent and somehow very small at the same time. The mountains do not care about the war, the dust does not take sides, and the film knows this. It frames its human figures against this landscape with a visual intelligence that is consistently asking you to feel the disproportion between the scale of the place and the scale of any individual life within it. It is asking you to feel that disproportion because that feeling, that sense of human smallness against indifferent physical grandeur, is exactly what Ahmed will be moving through alone for a significant portion of this story. What I expected, sitting down for the first time, was a kinetic thriller with a moral undercurrent. What I found was a moral drama with a thriller skeleton. That inversion matters. It changes where the film asks your attention to live. Because a kinetic thriller keeps your nervous system activated and your emotion at a slight remove, you are processing events as they happen, calibrating threat and survival in real time. But a moral drama asks you to slow down inside the experience. It asks you to feel the weight of choices rather than the speed of consequences. It asks you to sit with discomfort rather than be rescued from it by the next plot development. And The Covenant, at its best, wants to be that second thing. Whether it fully achieves it is a question we will arrive at honestly. But the intention, the genuine, visible, earnest intention, was clear from the very first minutes I spent with it. The atmosphere the film creates is one of compressed tension and moral seriousness, not the loud adrenaline pumping tension of the action set piece, but the quieter, more persistent tension of people operating in a context where a single miscalculation means death and where the miscalculations are not always tactical. Sometimes they are human. Sometimes the thing that gets people killed is the gap between what one person assumes and what another person knows. And that gap, the gap between assumption and knowledge, between surface and depth, between what you think you understand about another person and what that person is actually carrying, is what this film is fundamentally about. So, when I say that sitting with this film for the first time felt like something I had not quite expected, I mean it in the fullest sense. I did not expect to be moved. I expected to be engaged, Possibly impressed, perhaps pleasantly surprised by a director working outside his comfort zone. I did not expect to feel, somewhere around the midpoint of this film, a kind of quiet grief for something I had not named before I walked in. That grief is the film doing its best work. And even when the film falls short of its best, and it does in ways we will be precise about, that grief is real. It comes from somewhere true. And that, more than anything else, is why we are here. Let us walk through the story now, not as a list of events, not as a plot summary that tells you what happens, but as an experience, the way a story lives when you're inside it, feeling its decisions rather than cataloging them. We begin with Sergeant John Kinley, and the film is careful about how it introduces him. He is not a decorated hero. He is not a man defined by extraordinary qualities or cinematic charisma in the conventional sense. He is, to use the word the film almost seems to choose deliberately, functional. He is good at his job. He manages his unit with a kind of contained authority that comes from competence rather than force of personality. He has a wife at home, a child, a life that exists outside this landscape in a way that makes the landscape feel simultaneously more dangerous and more remote. He is a man doing what he was trained to do in a place that was once sharply defined by purpose and is now defined more by the accumulated weight of years. What the film does with Kinley in its early sections is establish him as a person of procedure. He follows rules, he works within systems. He trusts the institutional framework around him not out of naivety but out of the practical understanding that the institutional framework is what makes the mission function. He is, in this sense, a man of the system, and the film is going to put him in a position where the system fails, comprehensively, bureaucratically, with a particular cruelty of failure that comes not from malice but from indifference, and it needs us to understand exactly who this man is before that failure arrives so that we can feel what it does to him. The interpreter position in Kinley's unit has turned over several times. Interpreters are not always easily trusted. The relationship between an Armadan soldier and an Afghan interpreter carries a weight of history and assumption and cultural difference that makes intimacy difficult and suspicion easy. There have been incidents, not in this unit necessarily, but in the general texture of the conflict, that have made caution feel like wisdom. And so, when Ahmed arrives to fill the position, Kinley's initial orientation toward him is professional and measured, and carries the specific kind of respectful distance that is the military equivalent of keeping your options open. Ahmed is immediately different, not in the way that announces itself loudly, not with the kind of narrative signaling that tells you this person is going to matter. He is different in the way that quiet competence and deep personal reserves tend to be different, almost invisible until the moment you need them, and then absolutely unmistakable. He is not trying to impress Kinley, he is not performing usefulness. He is bringing to the work an intelligence and a deliberateness that exists entirely on his own terms. He has his own reasons for being here. We sense that early. The film does not show us those reasons immediately. It allows the question to rest in the air between us and the character, while we watch him work, and the patience of that choice. The willingness to let mystery accrue rather than explain is one of the places where the filmmaking genuinely serves the story. What becomes apparent gradually and then with sudden clarity is that Ahmed is not merely translating, he is reading. Reading the landscape, the people, the small details that accumulate into intelligence about where the danger is coming from and who is carrying it. He has a knowledge of this place, not just the language, but the culture, the tribal geography, the networks of loyalty and grievance that shape the movement of weapons and the decisions of men, that goes far beyond anything the military briefings can encode. And he is using that knowledge to protect the unit in ways that are not always immediately legible to Kinley. There are moments where Ahmed's choices seem to go against the grain of what the mission requires, moments where the unit's trust in him becomes the thing standing between a successful operation and catastrophic failure. The film builds this dynamic carefully and honestly, and it builds it without sentimentality. Ahmed is not a saint. He is a man with precise and powerful motivations of his own, and the film respects him enough to let those motivations be complicated. The mission at the center of the story's first act is the pursuit of an IED supply chain, the Taliban weapons network moving explosives into the hands of those who will use them against coalition forces. This is not glamorous work. It is the grinding, intelligence driven, frequently dangerous work of trying to identify and disrupt a supply chain that is constantly adaptive, constantly shifting its methods and its personnel. And within that mission framework, the film creates the conditions for the ambush that will divide the story in half and from which everything else follows. Here is what I keep returning to about the way this ambush is handled. It does not feel choreographed. It feels sudden and then sustained and then terrible in the very specific way that irreversible things are terrible. There is a sequence in which the tactical situation collapses with a speed that leaves no room for heroism in the conventional cinematic sense, only for the desperate, improvised, adrenaline driven attempt to stay alive and get out. Members of the unit do not survive. This is not something the film softens or aestheticizes. The cost is registered with a directness that earns the emotional weight of everything that follows. You are not watching spectacular death, you are watching the specific, unglamorous, world altering moment when other people's lives end and one man's continues. Kinley is wounded, seriously wounded. The kind of wound that removes choice from the equation, that reduces a person from an operative with plans and intentions to a body that requires carrying. And this is the moral hinge of the entire film. This is the moment from which everything else derives its meaning. Ahmed could leave. Let that land for a moment. Ahmed could leave. He is not under any tactical obligation to carry this man. The mission has failed. The unit is gone. The landscape is full of armed men who would kill him for being what he is. He has every rational reason to separate himself from this American soldier and make his own way towards safety. The calculation of self-preservation, the one that operates below moral reasoning, below culture and loyalty and conscience, the one that is just survival, that calculation would say, leave him. Ahmed does not leave him. What he does instead is one of the film's most extraordinary passages and the one that comes back to me most persistently when I think about what the story is. He begins the process of moving Kinley across terrain, across distance, in conditions that are measured not in hours but in days. He carries this man, not metaphorically but literally, physically carries him through a landscape that is trying to kill both of them, sustained by nothing that the film chooses to fully explain to us in the moment. We see what he does. We see the cost of it in his body and in the way the days accumulate on his face. But the film does not give us a speech about why. It does not reach for the moment of articulation where Ahmed explains himself to us or to Kinley. It trusts that action done with this level of commitment and at this level of cost speaks its own language, and it does. God, it does what Dar Salim brings to these sequences, and I want to be precise here because precision is what this performance deserves, is a quality that I can only describe as inhabited silence. He is not performing endurance, is enduring within the frame, within the camera's gaze, and you feel the difference between an actor performing a physical state and an actor locating something true within themselves and showing it to you without decoration. There are individual moments in this passage of the film, a particular stillness, a particular look at the unconscious man he is carrying, a particular series of decisions made in the dark that carry more moral weight than most complete films manage across their entire runtime. These are not small things, and here is what this choice, Ahmed's choice, does to the fabric of the story. It creates a debt that has no institutional framework. There is no form for this. There is no protocol. There is no medal or commendation or clearance pathway that is designed to acknowledge what Ahmed has done and what it cost him. The debt exists purely between two human beings, between the man who was carried and the man who carried him. And when Kinley eventually reaches safety, when the extraordinary, improbable, costly act of rescue results into the relief of medical care and evacuation, what he carries home with him is not just his life. He carries the knowledge of what it costs someone else to give him that life, and that knowledge is the most burdensome thing he has ever held. And the film then does something that surprised me on first watch and that I respect more on reflection. It follows Kinley home. It crosses the ocean with him, and it shows us not the triumphant return, but the disoriented, limping, quietly desperate return of a man who cannot reconcile the life he has come back to with the knowledge of what was done to preserve it. He is in his house, his family is there, the physical safety is real and complete, but he is not in any meaningful sense at rest, because Ahmed is still in Afghanistan, still in a country that is rapidly closing around the people who made themselves visible to the American presence, still waiting for a visa process that moves with the specific cruelty of bureaucratic indifference, not hostile, not malicious, just indifferent, just slow, just administrative, just following procedure in the way that procedures follow themselves, when the human cost of slowness is happening somewhere too far away to be felt by the people processing the forms. What the film does with this section, the American domestic section, the section set in a country at peace where Kinley is trying to discharge a debt that the country itself cannot see, is quieter than what came before, and in some ways more unsettling, because the contrast is not between war and peace, it is between a man who knows exactly what he owes and a system that has no category for that knowledge. Kinley begins to pursue Ahmed's case, not heroically, not through a single decisive act of will, but through the grinding, demoralizing, increasingly desperate process of trying to make a bureaucratic system acknowledge a human reality that the bureaucratic system is not designed to hold. He makes calls, he attends meetings, he speaks to people who are genuinely sympathetic and genuinely unable to help in any meaningful time frame. He pushes at the edges of what the system will allow, and the system moves as systems move when individual survival is at stake, with a kind of procedural indifference that is almost impossible to argue against, because it is never cruel. It is just slow, and slow in this case is a way of time. This is where the film locates one of its most important observations about the Afghan interpreter crisis specifically and bureaucratic failure generally. The people Kinley encounters are not villains. They are not obstructing him from malice. They are operating within a system that was not designed with sufficient urgency for the human cost it was generating, and they are doing so with the limited tools available to them. The film has the honesty and the restraint not to simplify this into a story about bad people doing bad things. It is a story about a system failing in the most ordinary, banal, and therefore most devastating ways systems can fail, by treating an urgent human situation as a manageable administrative backlog. And while that backlog is being managed, what is happening to Ahmed on the other side of the world is the story the film keeps returning to. Ahmed is in hiding, he is moving. He is using every resource of intelligence and courage and local knowledge that he possesses to stay alive in a country that has been transformed almost overnight into a place where being who he is and having done what he has done makes survival a daily act of improvisation. The Taliban are looking for him, not abstractly, specifically. There is a price on him. There are people actively closing the distance between his location and his death. And the film shows us enough of this in sequences that are tense in a very particular, patient, earned way to make the reality of his situation feel physical and immediate rather than reported or abstracted. What I want you to think about is what this structural choice does to your emotional experience of the film. Ritchie and his co-writers. Because this is a screenplay that came out of a specific creative process we will discuss in the next section, made the decision to divide the story between two geographies and two registers. The Afghanistan sequences operate in the mode of physical urgency, threat, movement, survival, the body's relationship to hostile terrain. The American sequences operate in the mode of moral urgency, a man in a safe room trying to make a broken system move faster, driven by the knowledge of what is at stake if it does not. And the film keeps cutting between these two registers, asking you to hold both simultaneously, to feel the physical danger and the procedural failure as aspects of the same fundamental reality, as two faces of the same abandonment. That structural choice is genuinely ambitious. It is more ambitious than the film gets credit for in its mixed critical reception. Whether it fully succeeds, whether the film maintains the emotional tension of both registers with equal consistency, is where my honest assessment begins to find its edges. There are moments in the American sections where the film loses some of the compression and urgency it needs to maintain the moral stakes at the same intensity as the civil sections. There are moments where what should feel like mounting unbearable pressure begins to feel like procedural progression. The film tells you something is urgent rather than making you feel the urgency in your body. And that difference between information and sensation, between being told the thing and being made to feel it, is one of the places where a different directorial pressure might have served the story better. But let me hold that thought for later, because we are not yet at the point of honest accounting. We are still inside the experience of the story itself, and the story has not finished doing its work. Because there comes a moment in this film, a specific turning point, arrived at through the gradual accumulation of everything I have described, where Kinley makes a decision. I, where the man who has been working within the system, pushing at its edges, trying to find the pathway that the system allows, reaches the end of what the system will provide, and in that moment something shifts in him. Something that had been held in place by procedure and patience and the reasonable expectation that the right institutional channels would eventually produce the right result, that something releases. And what takes its place is not heroism in the conventional sense. It is not the moment of cinematic transformation where the music swells and the protagonist becomes the person they were always meant to be. What takes its place is something quieter and in some ways more honest. It is the recognition that if the system is not going to do what needs to be done, then the only remaining option is to step outside the system entirely, to act on the basis of the debt rather than the procedure, to let the human reality be the authority rather than the institutional one. And here is where the film shifts completely. What that shift looks like, what it costs, and what it produces is something we will return to in the full spoiler section of this essay. But I want to pause here before we move through the craft of this film and its making to say something about the story structure itself. Because the shape of this narrative is not accidental, and understanding why it was built the way it was built changes how you experience the whole. The film is divided fundamentally into two problems. The first problem is physical. A man needs to survive a hostile landscape and reach safety. The second problem is institutional. A man needs to navigate a hostile bureaucracy and bring someone else to safety. These two problems are mirror images of each other in a way the film understands but never announces. In both cases, there is a human being in danger. In both cases, there is a system, one geographical and tactical, one administrative and political, that is working against survival. In both cases, there is someone trying to move through that system using the only tools available to them. And in both cases, the outcome depends not on the system relenting, but on a single human being refusing to let the system be the final word. Think about what that means. This is a film that is telling you, with the full weight of its narrative architecture, that institutional failure can only be answered by individual action. That the gap between what a system will provide and what a human situation requires can only be closed by one person deciding that the gap is their responsibility. That is not a comfortable political position. It does not fit neatly onto either end of any ideological spectrum. It is simply an observation about what happens when the people who are supposed to be responsible for a situation have already decided that the situation is someone else's problem. Someone has to step into that space. And the question the film is really asking, quietly, underneath all the tactical tension and bureaucratic frustration, is whether you would be that person. Whether any of us would be. That question lives in this film the way a nerve lives in a tooth. You do not notice it until you press on it, and then you cannot stop pressing. Now let us step outside the story and look at how this film came to exist. Because the journey from intention to finished film in the case of The Covenant is, in several respects, as interesting as the film itself. The genesis of this project, according to interviews Guy Ritchie gave around the time of the film's release, came from his sustained engagement with the real-world stories of Afghan interpreters who had served alongside coalition forces and then been left behind when the withdrawal came. This was not reportedly a subject he came to through a pitch meeting or a producer's suggestion. It was something he had been reading about, thinking about, and feeling the moral weight of for a period of time before the film took shape. The specific crisis of the special immigrant visa backlog, the thousands of Afghan nationals who had been promised a pathway to safety and were then caught in an administrative system that could not process their applications with anything approaching the speed their situation required, had generated significant reporting, and Ritchie, by all accounts, found himself unable to disengage from it. There is something in the texture of this particular injustice, the fact that it was produced not by malice but by institutional slowness, by the collision of urgency with procedure, that seems to have spoken directly to something in his sensibility as a storyteller. He is at his core a filmmaker interested in systems and the individuals who move through them. He has spent his career examining the way people navigate structures, criminal structures, institutional structures, social structures, and what happens when the structure fails the person. This subject was in that sense a natural fit even if the surface register was entirely new territory for him. A script that emerged from this engagement was developed with what appears to have been a genuine commitment to specificity. The story was not trying to dramatize the entire interpreter crisis as a political phenomenon. It was trying to distill the essential human truth of that crisis into a single relationship, one interpreter, one soldier, one debt, and let that particularity carry the universal weight. This is the instinct of a writer who understands that abstraction kills feeling. That you can tell someone about 10,000 abandoned interpreters and they will feel a generalized sadness that resolves quickly into the next theme. But you tell them about one interpreter and you show them his face and his choices and the specific texture of what he risks and what he loses, then you have created the conditions for actual feeling, for the kind of feeling that stays. The script makes that choice explicitly and holds it throughout. There is no step back toward the political panorama. The story remains radically intimate even when the forces operating on it are enormous. The casting of Dar Salim in the role of Ahmad is, in retrospect, one of the best decisions this production made, and there is reportedly more to it than a straightforward audition process. Salim, who was born in Denmark to an Iraqi father, brought to this role not just an extraordinary range as a performer, but a culture and personal understanding of the experience of displacement, of living between worlds, of inhabiting a space that Western institutions tend to categorize clumsily and individuals tend to navigate with the kind of daily complexity that never quite makes it into official accounts. He has spoken in various contexts about the experience of being someone whose identity does not fit a single national or cultural container, and that experience, lived rather than researched, informs everything about how he plays Ahmed. Ahmed is a man whose identity is entirely legible to him and largely legible to the American military apparatus around him. He is fully himself in a context that can only ever see him partially. And Salin communicates that gap, the gap between who someone is and who the system around them is able to perceive, with a precision and a dignity that is genuinely moving. After this film, it became impossible for me not to wonder how many other performances this quality could anchor. I hope the film opened doors it deserved to. Jake Gyllenhaal's route to this role followed a different logic, but one that is equally coherent when you look at his career as a body of choices. Gyllenhaal has spent the last decade making selections that seem consistently oriented toward characters who are carrying something heavy inside them, something that the social surface of their lives is only partially able to contain. He has drawn its scenes to men who are competent in their external roles and complicated in their internal ones. Men who have built effective selves but who find those selves under pressure in ways that reveal the gap between the performing self and the feeling self. Kinley is exactly this kind of character. He is a soldier who is good at soldiering, but the film gradually reveals that the architecture of his interior life, the values that actually govern his choices when the institutional framework is no longer providing the guidance, is built on something different from procedure. It is built on a personal code of debt and obligation that the system has no category for. And Gyllenhaal navigates the slow revelation of that interior architecture with the quiet intelligence that has become his signature. It is reportedly the case that he worked closely with veterans during his preparation for this role, not to acquire the surface markers of military authenticity, the posture and the jargon and the physical bearing, but to understand the inner experience of someone who has operated in that environment and then been returned to civilian life, carrying everything they brought back with them. That preparation is visible in his work. Not loudly, not in the way that demonstrated research tends to assert itself in performance, but quietly in the way a deep understanding of something shows up as simplicity rather than display. Now, here is a production fact that reshapes something specific about how you see this film. The Afghanistan you are watching was not filmed in Afghanistan. Virtually, the entire film was shot in Spain, primarily in the province of Almeria, in the southeast of the country, and in surrounding regions that offered the kind of dramatic arid landscape the production required. This is the same territory that famously served as the backdrop for the spaghetti westerns of the 1960s, the films of Sergio Leone, the landscape that became synonymous with a certain quality of mythic, sun-blasted, morally complex western storytelling. And there is something genuinely interesting about that lineage when you hold it against the Covenant story. Because the spaghetti western was itself a genre obsessed with death, with honor codes that exist outside official law, with the question of what a man owes another man when the institutional framework has collapsed or never arrived. The landscape carries that history, whether the production intended the resonance or simply found the right geography for purely practical reasons. The visual echo is there. You are watching a film about honor and death filmed in the landscape that made honor and death into myth. That fact reshapes how I see the landscape sequences. What I had been experiencing as simply excellent location work, as the impressive production achievement of creating a convincing Afghanistan, became something with additional texture once I knew where I was actually looking. The mountains and the dust and the specific quality of light that Almeria produces are not neutral. They carry associations, and those associations, even operating below conscious awareness, contribute to the sense that this story is not just a military drama, but something with the quality of a moral fable, something older than its contemporary setting, something that is using its contemporary specificity to access a human truth that belongs to a much longer history of obligation and code and the things people do for each other when the world around them has stopped providing adequate reasons. The cinematographer Ed Wild, who worked with Ritchie on this film as he has on several of his projects, made choices in this production that I want to examine carefully because they reveal the visual argument the film is making. Wild and Ritchie chose in the Afghanistan sequences to favor wide angles and natural light, to let the landscape assert itself with full force rather than finding angles that would subordinate it to the human drama. This is a choice that runs counter to certain conventional instincts in war filmmaking, where the tendency is to use the environment as pressure to make the landscape feel claustrophobic and threatening by pushing the camera close to the characters and using the geography as walls rather than space. Wild goes the other way. He gives you the space, he shows you how much of it there is. He makes the landscape feel not hostile but indifferent, which is in some ways more frightening. An enemy has a purpose this landscape has none. It will outlast every person moving through it regardless of which side they are on. That visual choice is doing the same work as the story. It is saying the forces at work here are larger than any one person's choices. But that makes the choices more significant, not less. Because choosing to act honorably in a universe that does not care whether you do is the only kind of honor that means anything. The film also contains, reportedly, a degree of technical consultation from veterans and security experts that went beyond the standard military advisors setup. According to accounts from the production, the team was interested in the granular accuracy of the tactical situations, not for the sake of authenticity as a performance of realism, but because the moral weight of the story depends on the situations feeling real rather than simulated. If the ambush feels like a movie ambush, the cost of it registers as movie cost. But if it feels like the kind of thing that actually happens to Agulises, the cost registers differently. It registers in your body, and the effort to achieve that bodily registration is visible in the way the action sequence it. They are not elegant, They are not choreographed in the ballet sense. They are messy and sudden and expensive in ways that feel true, and that truth is the result of a production decision to prioritize feeling over spectacle. There is a specific sequence, and I want to discuss this without entering full spoiler territory, so I will keep it impressionistic, in which Ahmed is moving through a contained environment under extreme threat, using his physical and environmental intelligence to navigate a situation that has almost no margin for error. The production design of this sequence and the way it was reportedly shot, practically with minimal intervention, allowing the physical reality of the space to generate the tension rather than relying on editing or score to manufacture it, is something that rewards attention. Because what you are watching in that sequence is not a movie character doing movie things. You are watching a human being using every skill and every reserve of nerve they possess to solve a problem that is trying to kill them. The texture of that effort, the specific quality of someone who is genuinely tired and genuinely afraid and genuinely committed, doing something that requires all three of those conditions to coexist, is where Dar Salim's physical preparation and the production's practical approach intersect. The result is one of the most completely believed sequences in the film. The score of this film is the work of Chris Benstead, a composer who has collaborated with Ritchie across several of his projects and who approached The Covenant with an understanding that the conventional war film score, the one that builds and swells and tells you how to feel with the precision of a stage direction, was not what this material needed. What Benstead's work does at its best is exactly what great film scoring does at its most invisible. It creates emotional conditions rather than emotional instructions. It opens a space in which feeling can arrive rather than announcing the feeling's imminent arrival. The score in the survivor sequences is particularly interesting in this regard. There are passages in which Benstead makes the compositional choice to thin the texture almost to nothing, to let the score become a kind of breath rather than a statement. And in those passages, the silence between the notes does as much work as the notes themselves. You feel the isolation, the vast indifferent silence of the landscape pressing in, the specific quality of being very alone in a very large place with very few options. Music that is not trying to be noticed is often the most noticed. And Benstead's restraint in the places where a lesser score would have been loudest is one of the film's genuine achievements. There is also the sound design more broadly, which operates in close collaboration with the score and which handles the transition between the two geographies, Afghanistan and America, with a care that is worth noticing. The American domestic sequences have a soundscape that feels almost oppressively ordinary. The ambient sounds of a house, a neighborhood, a world that has nothing threatening in it. And rather than making that ordinariness feel safe, the film uses it to create a different kind of unease, the unease of normalcy when you know that something catastrophic is happening somewhere else. The sound of a quiet house becomes a measure of the distance between two realities, between the world that has been made safe and the world that is still dangerous, and that sonic contrast, ordinary life pressing against extraordinary stakes, is part of how the film keeps the Afghanistan situation feeling immediate even when we are no longer physically there. Now let us talk honestly about what this film achieves at the level of craft and performance, not as a list of compliments, but as a genuine examination of where it succeeds and the specific nature of that success. The performance at the absolute center of this film, the one around which everything else organizes itself, is Dar Salim's Ahmad. I want to spend real time with this because it deserves it and because I think the critical discourse around this film has not always given it the specific attention it merits. Salim is doing something in this performance that requires three things to happen simultaneously and without apparent effort. He is building a character who is fully interior, whose motivations and history and code of values are all operating below the surface of what the screenplay explicitly delivers, while simultaneously communicating that interior world to the audience with sufficient clarity that we never feel confused about who he is or why he does what he does. And he's doing both of those things while working in a second language opposite an American star with a very different register in a production that is asking him to carry the moral argument of the entire film. The scene that proves this completely, the scene I come back to when I want to locate the exact heartbeat of what this performance is a quiet one. It is not an action sequence. It is not a moment of explicit emotional declaration. It is a scene in which Ahmed is alone or effectively alone, and the film simply watches him doing something small and ordinary, and lets the weight of everything he carries show itself without commentary. What Salim does in that moment is locate the exact quality that the entire film is trying to articulate about this man. He communicates not suffering, not the performance of suffering, not the demonstration of pain, but the specific quality of a person who has absorbed enormous things and is continuing to function. Because continuing to function is what they know how to do, and because the alternative is not available to them. It is quiet, it is complete, it does not ask for your admiration or your pity, it simply is. And in being simply what it does more for your understanding of Ahmed than any amount of expository dialogue could have done. There is a particular quality to Gyllenhaal's work in this film that I want to name carefully because I think it has been both praised and misread. His performance as Kinley is sometimes described as restrained, and that word is accurate but incomplete. What he is doing is not simply restraint in the sense of subtraction, of removing emotional display for the sake of appearing more real. He is doing something more specific. He is playing a man who has learned, through years of operating in a professional environment that does not reward interior disclosure, to manage the gap between what he feels and what he shows. And the film is tracking, with considerable patience and precision, the gradual breakdown of that management, the places where the gap narrows, the places where what is inside begins to show itself through the surface, not because he has chosen to show it, but because the weight of what he is carrying has become too great for the surface to fully contain. That arc, from managed distance to cracked open, is what gives his performance its shape, and the way it maps onto the story's larger arc, in which a man who trusted the system to handle his obligations gradually comes to understand that the system is not going to, is one of the film's most coherent achievements. The screenplay, and here I want to give genuine credit to the writing, which I think gets under-examined in discussions of this film, is more carefully constructed than it initially appears. The first act does something that seems, in the moment, like simple scene setting, but reveals itself later as very precise preparation. Every scene in the early sections of the film is, among other things, establishing the nature of the environment Ahmad moves through, the assumptions, the hierarchies, the way knowledge is valued and discounted, the way an Afghan man is perceived by the American military structure he works within, not with hostility, not with contempt, but with a kind of functional limitation of vision that means he is always being seen as less than the full complexity of what he actually is. The screenplay lays this in quietly. And then, when Ahmed does what he does, when he makes the choice that the film hinges on, the weight of all that established context arrives because you understand what he is choosing against. You understand what it cost to make himself invisible enough to survive in that environment, and what it now costs him to make himself entirely visible in the act of rescue. The screenplay has been building toward that understanding without telling you it was building toward it. That is good writing. The visual language of the film has an argument to make that goes beyond location photography. Edward's camera makes a choice in the Ahmed sequences that it does not make in the Kinley sequences, and that choice is visible once you know to look for it. In the sequences that follow Ahmed, the survival sequences, the movement through the hostile landscape, the camera tends to find positions that emphasize Ahmed's agency. We see him making decisions. We see him choosing angles, calculating risks, reading terrain. The camera places us in a relationship to him that acknowledges his intelligence and his authority in this environment. In the Kinley sequences, particularly the American domestic sequences, the camera does something subtly different. It places us in a relationship to Kinley that emphasizes the limits of his perception. He is in a space he knows perfectly, a house, a city, a culture, and yet he cannot see what he needs to see. The visual grammar is quietly suggesting that the man who looks most in control is operating in the most profound kind of blindness, while the man who looks most vulnerable is the one who actually sees. That visual argument is never stated, it is shown, and it works. I want to spend a moment on one more craft element that does not always get the attention it deserves in discussions of this film: the handling of time. The film covers a significant span, months, in the sections depicting Ahmed's situation, and a comparable period in the sections depicting Kinley's bureaucratic struggle. And the way it manages the passage of time is, I think, one of its more intelligent former choices. It uses visual transitions and the accumulation of detail rather than explicit temporal markers to show you that time is passing, that the urgency is mounting, that the window is closing. There is no on screen counter, there is no voice over narration telling you how many days have elapsed. Instead, you feel it in the way the characters look, the way their faces carry the weight of the accumulating days, the way the administrative conversations Kinley has begin to repeat themselves with subtle variations that tell you the circle is closing without opening. This is filmmaking that trusts its audience to do the work of temporal orientation, and that trust is itself a form of respect that the audience, if it is paying attention, receives as a gift. The score, returning to it for a moment, has a specific musical grammar that I want to note. Chris Benstead built the thematic material around a motif that is introduced very early, a melodic fragment of notable simplicity, almost deliberately underwritten as a musical idea, and then develops it across the film in ways that mirror the emotional development of the story. In its earliest appearances, the motif is restrained almost to the point of absence. Later, it accumulates weight and texture in a way that mirrors the accumulating weight of Ahmad's situation. By the film's final act, when the motif returns with its full development, it lands with the force of everything that has been built. This is the oldest technique in film scoring, the leitmotif, the musical idea that grows with the drama, but it requires genuine compositional intelligence to execute without becoming mechanical or obvious. Banstead executes it with a care that serves the film without calling attention to itself. The score knows when to speak and when to be silent, and the quality of its silence is as expressive as the quality of its sound. But now we need to be honest, because the same integrity that allowed us to recognize what this film achieves requires us to be equally precise about where it falls short. And it falls short in ways that matter, not catastrophically, not in ways that undermine the film's core achievements, but in ways that prevent it from being the film it was clearly trying to be. And the distance between the film this wanted to be and the film it actually is, that distance is exactly where a 6.2 rating lives. The most significant problem is pacing, and I want to be specific about where the pacing fails, rather than making the kind of general complaint that reveals nothing. The American sections, the sections in which Kinley navigates the bureaucratic process of trying to secure Ahmed's visa and extraction, suffer from a structural problem that no amount of fine acting or intelligent writing can fully resolve. The problem is that bureaucratic frustration, as a dramatic experience, has a very specific ceiling. The first time a door closes on Kinley, you feel the frustration and the stakes with full force. The second time you feel it slightly less. By the third and fourth iterations of the same essential experience, the same conversation with a different face, the same wall dressed in slightly different administrative language, what should be accumulating as mounting unbearable pressure begins instead to feel like procedural repetition. The emotional escalation the film is seeking in these sections is, in principle, achievable. Other films have found ways to make bureaucratic failure feel unbearable, but it requires either a greater variety of specifically painful obstacles or a more radical escalation of what is at stake in each individual conversation, or a compression that acknowledges the audience's understanding of the pattern and does not require the pattern to be demonstrated 6 times. The film, in its current form, demonstrates the pattern too many times without finding sufficient variation to prevent the diminishing returns. This is, I suspect, a structural problem that existed in the screenplay and was not resolved in the editing. There is a version of this film in which the American sections are tighter by perhaps 15 minutes and in which the moral urgency of Kinley's situation is maintained at the same level of intensity as the physical urgency of Ahmed's. In the current version, there is a disproportion that the film never quite closes. And because so much of the film's emotional argument depends on the parallel between the two situations, on our ability to hold both registers simultaneously with equal intensity, the pacing problem in American sections is not a minor texture issue. It is a wound that affects the structural argument. The secondary characters throughout the film are another honest limitation. The supporting members of Kinley's unit are, with a few exceptions, given insufficient depth to register as fully human before the ambush arrives to assign them narrative significance. This is a common problem in films of this type. The logistical demands of establishing the tactical situation and the central relationship can crowd out the space needed to make every life in the unit feel individually valuable. But the consequence is that when those lives are lost, the emotional register is more generalized than it should be. You feel the fact of loss rather than the specific loss of specific people. And in a film that is making such a precise argument about the specific weight of individual human life, about the irreducible particularity of one man's debt to one other man, that generalization is a thematic inconsistency as well as an emotional one. The character of Kinley's wife, played with genuine commitment by Emily Beecham, is perhaps the most visible example of the film's uneven handling of its supporting world. She is given enough screen time to establish her existence in Kinley's life, but not enough, and perhaps not the right kind of time, to become a fully realized perspective in the film's moral landscape. She is aware that her husband is not fully present even when he is physically at home. She understands in the way that people who love soldiers often understand that part of him is still somewhere else, and her love for him is genuine and visible. But the film does not give her the space to be a voice in its moral argument rather than simply a presence in his domestic life. She is positioned as the thing Kinley returned to, as the anchor of the life that was preserved, but not as a person who has her own view on the debt he is trying to discharge. A conversation between them about the specific nature of what he owes Ahmed, about whether his pursuit of this obligation is coming at a cost to the life he fought to return to, that conversation would have given the domestic sections a different kind of moral texture. Its absence is a missed opportunity that the film, I think, would have been richer for seizing. There are also moments, and I want to be fair about the specificity of this, in which Guy Ritchie's stylistic instincts and the material's moral seriousness pull in slightly different directions. There is tendency in this direction even in this film, where he is clearly working to subordinate his diary to the story, toward a certain aesthetic assertiveness, toward letting the camera do something clever in a moment that might be better served by the camera doing nothing. These moments are not frequent, and they are not catastrophic, but they are visible to anyone paying attention to the relationship between form and feeling in a film. There is a handful of shots, perhaps 3 or 4 across the whole film, where the visual interest of a particular angle or movement draws your eye in a way that slightly distances you from the emotional experience rather than deepening it. A different cinematographic choice in those moments, one of less visual invention and more emotional subordination, would have served the film better. This is a comment on creative choices, not on creative character, and it is offered in the spirit of honest analysis, which is the only kind this film deserves. One further honest observation: there are moments in the film where its sincerity, and I mean this genuinely, the film is sincerely felt and sincerely made, tips into a kind of earnestness that slightly overreaches. Moments where the emotional instruction becomes a little more legible than the best filmmaking allows, where the score arrives a fraction of a second before the feeling rather than with it, where the framing says feel this in a way that very slightly preempts the feeling you are already generating on your own. The gap between those two things, feeling something because the film created the conditions for it, and feeling something because the film directed you to feel it, is small but perceptible. And in a film that is otherwise asking you to trust the story's own weight, those moments of slight overcalculation are more noticeable than they would be in a film with less overall intelligence. They are the limitations of a filmmaker who cares very much about the effect of what he is making, which is a more forgivable limitation than its opposite, but it is still a limitation. Underneath all of the craft and all of the story, underneath every scene and every character decision and every production choice, what is this film actually trying to say? What is the thing at its emotional and intellectual core that it has been building toward all along? The most honest I can give is this. The film is trying to say something about what obligation means when the institution that was supposed to carry it has walked away. It is trying to say that there is a form of debt, a specific intimate human scale debt that cannot be delegated, cannot be filed, cannot be addressed through any process more abstract than one person acting on behalf of another. It is trying to say that loyalty, when it is genuine, when it comes from the recognition of another person's full humanity rather than from their utility to your mission, creates an obligation that has no expiry date. That survives the end of the conflict in which it was created. That survives bureaucratic processes and political transitions and the simple passage of time that encourages forgetting. The film is saying some debts do not go away because you crossed an ocean. Some debts come with you. This is not, on its surface, a particularly radical idea. The notion that we owe people who have helped us is ancient and universal, but the film is doing something more specific than simply illustrating that principle. It is situating that principle in a context, the context of America's departure from Afghanistan, in which the institutional failure to honor a collective debt is so massive and so documented that any individual act of honoring a personal debt becomes, by contrast, a kind of radical gesture. A gesture that says, I know the system has already made its decision. I know the political calculation has already been run. I know that the people responsible for the larger debt have already found ways to justify not paying it. And I am telling you that none of that changes what I owe this specific person. The system's failure to act does not become my reason not to act. If anything, it becomes my reason to act more urgently. That is a quietly revolutionary moral position. And the film makes it without ever stating it. It makes it through narrative architecture and character choice and the accumulated weight of what we have watched these two people do for each other. It makes it by showing, not telling. And in the moments where it succeeds at this, in the moments where the story's moral argument lands in your body before it reaches your mind, it achieves something that very few war films achieve. It changes the scale of the question it is asking. It stops being a film about one soldier and one interpreter and becomes a film about what we owe each other when the world is not looking. When there is no reward and no recognition and no institutional sanction. When the only authority for the action you are about to take is the debt itself, the symbols and motifs the film returns to are worth naming. The motif of carrying of one person physically carrying another runs through the film as its central image. Ahmed carries Kinley, and then Kinley attempts to carry Ahmed, not physically, but through the system, through the bureaucratic and eventually the direct personal effort to get him out. Carrying is the film's metaphor for obligation, for what it looks like to actually, in the physical or institutional or personal sense, bear the weight of someone else's survival. The image is simple, its resonance is not. There is also the motif of sight, of being seen versus being invisible. Ahmed has spent the bulk of his professional life in a context where he is instrumentally necessary and personally invisible. He is essential to the mission but not fully perceived as a person within it, and yet his sight, his ability to perceive the environment with full and genuine attention, is what saves Kinley's life. The film is interested in the moral implications of perception, in the idea that seeing someone fully as a complete human being with their own history and values and interior life is itself an ethical act, and that the failure to see fully is its own kind of violence, even when it is not intentional. The system that failed the interpreters was not malicious, it simply did not see. And the film is asking whether the failure to see, when seeing would have been possible, is morally equivalent to the refusal to see. The question of identity of who Ahmad is and how he is perceived runs through the entire film as a persistent undercurrent. He is defined within the American military context by his function. He is the interpreter. He is the local asset. He is the man who bridges the language gap. These are real roles, real functions, but they are partial descriptions of a complete human being. And the film gradually works to expand the perception of Ahmed beyond those functional categories, to make us see him as someone with a history, with grief, with the code of values that predates and transcends the conflict he is working within. The revelation of his specific personal history, the reason he took the interpreter position in the first place, is one of the film's most carefully handled moments. It reframes everything we thought we understood about his motivations. It does not make him less admirable, it makes him more human. And those are not always the same thing. The real world resonance of all of this is, I think, unavoidable and necessary. The film was made knowing that the audience watching it would bring with them the images from Kabul airport in August 2021, would bring the news reports about the visa backlog, would bring whatever personal feeling they cared about the Afghan withdrawal and the specific nature of what was abandoned there. The film does not exploit that context. It does not wave the flag of current events as a shortcut to emotional relevance, but it does allow that context to sit in the room with the story, and the story is honest enough and specific enough that the context deepens rather than cheapens it. What this film understands, and this is a phrase I do not use lightly because I believe the film genuinely does understand it, is that the moral injury of institutional abandonment is felt most acutely not at the level of the institution but at the level of the individual. The people who suffer when a government breaks its promise are not abstractions. They are specific, complete, irreplaceable human beings. And the stories of specific people told with care and honesty and without sentimentality are the only thing powerful enough to make that truth felt rather than merely known. This brings us to the question of where this film sits in a larger conversation. Not the conversation about a franchise or a series. This is not that kind of film, but the conversation about Guy Ritchie's body of work and the conversation about the genre of the war film in the period following America's two-decade engagement in Afghanistan. Within Ritchie's filmography, The Covenant occupies an unusual and genuinely interesting position. He built his reputation on a very specific kind of cinematic energy, a postmodern, self-aware, formally inventive approach to genre material that celebrated the pleasure of craft without any particular interest in moral weight. The films that made him famous were not interested in what violence means. They were interested in what violence looks like, in the aesthetic pleasure of a well-constructed scene, in the satisfactions of plot mechanics executed with wit and precision. That sensibility is legitimated on its own terms. It produces films that are genuinely pleasurable and formally impressive in specific ways. But it is not the sensibility of a filmmaker who is asking what his stories mean about the world. The Covenant represents in this context something of a reckoning. Whether it was consciously undertaken as such is something only Ritchie himself could say. But the film reads as a filmmaker testing whether his considerable technical skills can be placed in the service of moral seriousness, whether the eye that made low, stock snap and pulse can slow down enough to let grief and obligation settle without reaching for the next clever angle. The answer, based on the evidence of the finished film, is partly he demonstrates real capacity for the stillness the material requires in a significant portion of the film. He shows that his visual intelligence can operate in a register that does not prioritize style over feeling. But he also demonstrates in those moments I described earlier where style asserts itself slightly ahead of feeling that the older instincts have not been fully subordinated. The filmmaker who loves the interesting shot has not disappeared. He has been disciplined, but he remains present. Whether residual presence reads as personality or limitation probably depends on your relationship with his earlier work and how completely you believe a filmmaker must erase his own style in the service of somber material. What the film adds to the larger conversation about the war film genre in this period is, I think, something valuable and relatively rare. The post-Afghanistan war film has tended to divide along a fairly predictable axis. On one side, the prestige drama focused on the experience of American soldiers, their heroism, their sacrifice, their psychological On the other side, the more openly political film, the one that indicts the war itself, that examines the decision making that sent people there and the decision making that brought them home. Both of these modes have produced important films, but both of them tend to position the experience of Afghan people, as context rather than subject, as the landscape in which American stories happen rather than as the site of human lives that are complete and significant on their own terms. The Covenant does something that relatively few Western productions in this phase have attempted. It makes an Afghan man the moral center of the story. Not a political center, not the figure of structural critique, but the person whose choices carry the greatest weight and whose story the film ultimately organizes itself around. Ahmed is not background. He is not the reason why Kinley's story is interesting. He is, when you look clearly at the film's architecture, the protagonist of the story's moral argument, even when Kinley is the protagonist of its surface narrative. That choice, to make the Afghan man the moral center rather than the moral backdrop, is not the same as making the film his story in full. The film's structural limitations, which we have already named, mean that his interiority is accessed partially rather than completely. We understand enough about Ahmed to feel the weight of what he does, but not always enough to fully inhabit his perspective. That is a real limitation. But the intention to build a Western war film around the moral primacy of an Afghan man's choices is an intention that matters. And it matters in the context of a genre that has too often asked us to see Afghanistan as a place where American stories happened. In that sense, whatever its imperfections, this film is doing something the genre needed someone to do. It is asking who the war was about and arriving at an answer that the official historical record has been too slow to embrace. It is putting a face and a name and a history and a code of honor to the category of person who was most completely failed by the institutional collapse that followed the withdrawal. And it is asking you, asking each specific person watching, to call that face and that name and that history in your mind, not as a political symbol but as a human being. That is what cinema can do that policy cannot. That is what a story does that a report cannot. It makes you feel the weight of a specific life. It makes the abstract particular. It makes the institutional failure personal. And that is why, for all its imperfections, this film matters. That is why we are here. Let us begin at the beginning of what the film has been withholding, because the most important information in this story is not held back for dramatic effect alone. It is held back because the order in which you receive it determines the moral experience of the whole. And when it arrives, when the film finally opens the door it has been standing in front of, everything you have watched changes its color. The ambush. Let us start there, because everything in the second half of this film is a consequence of it, and understanding what actually happens in that sequence, not just tactically but morally, is essential to understanding everything that follows. Kinley's unit has been tracking an IED supply network. This is the tactical mission. But what the film has been doing, quietly and without announcement, in all the scenes leading up to the ambush, is establishing the texture of the relationship between Kinley and Ahmed at its current stage of development. They are not friends. They are not yet fully trusting. They are two professionals who have begun to develop a working respect that neither of them would yet describe as personal. Ahmed has proven himself reliable. He has demonstrated a quality of observation and a depth of local knowledge that has made the unit safer and more effective. Kinley respects this in the way a military man respects competence. But the film has been careful to show us that this respect has limits, that it exists within a professional framework and has not yet crossed into something more fully human. That distinction matters enormously for what is about to happen. The sequence in which the ambush occurs is, as I noted in the craft section, one of the most effectively realized action sequences in the film. But what I want to talk about now, in full spoiler territory, is not the tactical reality of it, but the moral geometry. The ambush succeeds. The Taliban force that has been waiting for them know they are coming, and the questions of how and why are part of the film's carefully established texture of mistrust that runs through the interpreter relationships in the unit. One of the earlier interpreters, whose departure the film registered briefly and moved past, becomes, in retrospect, a shadow over the entire scene. The ambush did not happen randomly, it happened because information moved. And the film places that fact in the background rather than the foreground because the moral of the story is not about the interpreter who betrayed them. The moral is about the one who did not. Most of the unit does not survive. The film does not dwell on this with operatic grief. There is no extended death sequence, no tearful farewells. The deaths happened with the speed and disorientation that real ambushes apparently produce, and the experience of watching the unit dissolve in those minutes is one of the film's most effective pieces of sensory storytelling. You do not process it cleanly. You are not given time to locate your feelings before the next thing is already happening. And that disruption, that inability to grieve the deaths cleanly as they occur, mirrors exactly the experience of surviving a violence in which the psychological work of processing what happened comes much later, if at all. Kinley is wounded. The specific nature of the wound is significant. It is not a minor wound dressed for dramatic effect. It is the kind of wound that makes him a dead weight rather than an asset. That removes him from the calculation of survival as an active agent and makes him entirely and completely dependent on someone else. This is a man who has spent his career being responsible for others, making decisions that determine outcomes, carrying the authority of rank and training and institutional mandate. And in a single sequence of violence, all of that is stripped away. He is a body that needs carrying, that is all. And the film sits with the full humiliation and the full vulnerability of that transformation without softening it. Ahmed has options. The film makes this clear, and it makes it clear specifically, so that his choice registers with the full weight it deserves. He is not trapped with Kinley. He is not physically unable to leave. The tactical situation, as it has resolved, offers him a path, a route, a direction, a way out that does not involve the weight of an unconscious American soldier. And the film lets this beat land in silence. It gives Ahmed a moment, brief but perceptible, in which we watch him look at Kinley and look at the landscape and make a calculation. And then he begins to carry him. I have spent a great deal of time thinking about why that beat, that silent moment of decision, is the emotional center of the entire film. Not the action sequences, not the bureaucratic struggle, not the reunion at the end. That silent moment, because what it shows us is a person making a choice in the complete absence of any institutional or social or practical rationale for making it. There is no audience, there is no reward structure, there is no authority figure watching whose approval Ahmed might be seeking. There is no tribal or cultural obligation that would specifically require this act. There is only one man looking at another man and deciding that he is going to live. And that decision, made in silence, without ceremony, without the comfort of any larger justification, is what the word covenant in the title is actually referring to, not a spoken agreement, not a written contract, a choice made in private by a person who understood exactly what it was going to cost. What follows is the most extraordinary passage in the film and the one that defines it most completely. Ahmed carries Kinley across approximately 100 kilometers of hostile territory over the course of what the film represents as several days. This is not, in the film's treatment, a montage of heroism. It is not the kind of inspirational journey that accumulates into triumph. It is an honest reckoning with what that act looks like from the inside, with the physical cost, the psychological cost, the moments of near discovery, and the improvisations required to avoid it. Ahmed moves mostly at night. He feeds Kinley from whatever he can find. He treats the wound with what he has. He makes decisions about routes and hiding places and the timing of movement, using the full weight of his knowledge of this landscape, this culture, these people. He is running the most complex tactical operation of the entire film, entirely alone, without equipment, without backup, without the institutional support that soldiers typically require to function in hostile environments. And the film shows us this with a quality of attention that respects the difficulty rather than aestheticizing it. There are sequences in which Ahmed is clearly at the edge of what his body can sustain, sequences in which the camera stays close enough to register the toll without turning the toll into spectacle. And that combination, the physical depletion and the continuing sharpness of mind, is what gives these sequences their quality of something more than a survival story. He's serving on behalf of someone else. The calculus of his endurance is not self preservation, it is obligation. And there is a specific quality to that, a specific flavor of human effort that is only available when the goal is not your own survival but someone else's. That Salim communicates with remarkable precision. There is a sequence in this passage, one that I want to describe carefully because it carries enormous thematic weight, in which Ahmed, alone in the dark with the unconscious Kinley, performs an act of medical care that is at the edge of what is possible with the resources he has. The specifics are less important than what the scene communicates, that he is not merely transporting a body, he is choosing, again in that moment, to keep this specific life going. He could stop. The act of stopping would require no decision, it would simply be the cessation of an ongoing choice. But he chooses again actively and deliberately to continue. And that repetition of the choice, the film's insistence that it is not a single decision made once and enacted automatically, but a decision that must be renewed in every moment that offers an alternative, is one of the most important moral observations the film makes. This is what commitment actually is. The film is saying, not a promise made once, a choice made again and again, every time the cost of making the other choice presents itself. The Taliban forces in this section of the film are not characterized as villains in the conventional action film sense. They are presented as a threat that is specific, organized, and purposeful, men who know what they are looking for and have reasons of their own for their actions. The film does not reach for demonization. It does not need to, because the moral argument it is making does not depend on the quality of the opposition. Ahmed did not become an interpreter because of political belief or economic necessity, or any of the simpler categories we might have assigned. He became an interpreter because the people who killed his child were using a supply network that American intelligence was tracking. He put himself inside that investigation because it was the only way available to him to pursue something that the official systems were not going to pursue on behalf of one specific Afghan child. He was not serving the mission, he was serving a debt of his own, a debt of grief, a debt of father's love that had no other outlet. Think about what this does to the film's moral architecture. Every choice Ahmed makes in the entire story, every moment of intelligence and courage, and the extraordinary act of carrying, is now readable in a different register. He was not simply a loyal employee performing above expectation, he was a man whose deepest wound and the mission he was given to perform were the same thing. He was doing the work that needed doing because the doing of it was the closest thing to justice he could find for his son. And when he carried Kinley across that landscape, when he made and remade the choice to keep this American soldier alive, he was not acting simply out of loyalty to Kinley as a person. He was acting out of a code of honor that is rooted in something much older and much more painful than professional obligation. He was acting as someone who has already lost everything that can be lost and has therefore arrived at a kind of clarity about what matters and what does not. A man who has buried his child has already survived the worst thing. What remains is the question of what he does with the life that continues after the worst thing. This revelation does not make Ahmed a saint. It does not turn his choices into something mystical or beyond ordinary human reach. It makes them more human, not less. It gives them a root system that is not abstract honor or cinematic heroism, but specific, lived, bodily grief, the kind of grief that exists in the body as a permanent weight and that occasionally becomes the fuel for acts that other people, looking in from outside, describe as extraordinary. Putting yourself in the same category of risk as the person you owe, making your own survival contingent on theirs, in the same way their survival was once contingent on yours. This is a moral logic that is not entirely rational. The most effective extraction might well have been organized without Kinley's physical presence. His presence adds risk rather than reducing it. But the film is not making an argument about tactical efficiency. It is making an argument about what a covenant requires. A covenanted, the word in the title, the concept the film has been building toward, is not a transaction. It is not the exchange of equivalent values. It is a binding made between people, and the binding is only honored when you bring yourself to it, when you do not send someone in your place, when the body that goes back is the same body that was carried out. The reunion between Kinley and Ahmed, when it happens, is one of the scenes I want to spend real time with because it is where the film either earns its emotional weight or reveals that weight to be constructed rather than discovered. And what the film does with this reunion is, to its enormous credit, resist the obvious. There is no tearful embrace. There is no dialogue that articulates the depth of what these men mean to each other, no moment in which the full arc of the relationship is spoken out and confirmed. The reunion is practical. It is physically compressed by the urgency of the situation they are in. And yet it is, somehow, the most emotionally full scene in the entire film. What the film understands about this moment, what it understands about these two specific men, is that neither of them is going to find words adequate to what exists between them. Ahmed is not going to tell Kinley what it cost him to carry him across those mountains. Kinley is not going to find language equal to what it feels like to be back in this landscape, back in this situation, having come back by choice rather than by military assignment. The things that matter most between them exist below the threshold of articulation, and the film honors that by not trying to articulate them. What it does instead is let the physical proximity speak, let the act of being in the same space again, after everything that has intervened, carry the weight that words cannot. And Dar Salim and Jake Gyllenhaal find in their shared scenes in this section of the film a quality of presence with each other that is entirely different from their early interactions. In the early sequences, there was a professional distance that both actors maintained with precision. Now, there is not warmth exactly, because warmth is too comfortable a word for what these men carry between them. There is a recognition, a full, unbounded recognition of what the other person is. Not the professional surface, not the institutional category, the person. And that recognition, communicated without speech, without gesture, simply through the way two people exist in the same space when they have seen each other's most essential self, is the film's most quietly extraordinary achievement. The extraction sequence that follows is where the film's action filmmaking is, I think, at its most purposeful. Because by this point in the story, we are not watching action for its own sake. We are watching it for what it costs and what it reveals about the people performing it. The tactical situation that Kinley and his team must navigate is dangerous in a way that is not amplified for dramatic effect. The film has established the operational reality of the environment with sufficient specificity that when the action arrives, its difficulty registers as real rather than cinematic. There are casualties, there are moments in which the outcome is genuinely unclear. There are decisions made under pressure that the film does not present as obviously right, decisions that carry risk and cost, and the specific quality of choices made in environments where the best available option is still genuinely bad. Ahmed's role in the extraction, in getting himself and his family to the extraction point, is its own story, and one the film handles with the same commitment to honest difficulty it brought to the earlier survival sequences. He is not passive, he is not simply waiting to be rescued. He is an active participant in his own extraction, using the same skills and the same intelligence that kept Kinley alive across those mountains. The film is careful about this. It does not want Ahmed's rescue to read as the reversal of the earlier dynamic, as the capable American coming back to save the helpless Afghan. Ahmed is not helpless. He never was. The difficulty of his situation was always structural rather than personal, created by forces outside his individual capacity to address, rather than by any limitation in the man himself. And the extraction sequence preserves this by giving him genuine agency within it. He is solving problems, he is making decisions. He is, as he has always been, the most observant and most precise person in whatever space he occupies. There is a specific moment, one that I would describe as the film's most genuinely heartbreaking passage, that arrives in the extraction sequence before its conclusion. I will not describe it with clinical precision because some moments deserve to be encountered rather than pre-processed. But I will say that the film introduces, at this point, a cost that had not been explicitly visible before, a specific human cost of the time that the bureaucratic process consumed, a face, a life, a person who exists now only in the past tense, and the film does not use this cost operatically. It does not build a set piece around it. It simply shows you what was lost in the time that passed while the form was being processed, and it does not ask you to draw a conclusion. The conclusion is already there. The face of what bureaucratic indifference produces is already in the frame. The film trusts you to feel what you are looking at, what that moment does to the emotional register of the sequence that follows, and to the feeling with which you watch the extraction reach its conclusion, is exactly what great narrative timing produces. The grief of what cannot be recovered is still active in you when the relief of what is recovered arrives. You cannot separate the two feelings. The success of the extraction is real. The people who make it out are alive. But the film insists, through the timing of that heartbreaking moment, through its placement immediately before the resolution, that the success and the loss are parts of the same event, that the rescue happened and the loss happened, and both of them are the consequence of the same system that moved too slowly. That is not a comfortable conclusion. It is not the clean triumph that the genre might have offered, but it is the honest one. The ending of this film is the thing I keep returning to most persistently. Not because it is the most dramatic moment or the most visually striking, but because of what it chooses to show and what it chooses to withhold. And those choices taken together make an argument about resolution that I think is more sophisticated than the film's mixed critical reception acknowledged. The final sequence of the film, before the closing title cards that give us the factual context about the real interpreter crisis, involves Ahmed and his family arriving at safety, at America, at the country that the film has been holding as a horizon throughout its second half. Kinley is there, the meeting happens, and the film handles this moment with the same resistance to emotional instruction that it brought to the reunion in the field. It does not give us a scene that summarizes what these men mean to each other. It does not give us a tearful articulation of the arc we have watched. It gives us something smaller and more true. Two people in the same space again, on the other side of everything, alive, together, in a country that is not trying to kill either of them. And then the closing title cards arrive, the factual accounting, the real numbers, the interpreter still waiting, the visa still unprocessed, the people still in danger, the specific weight of the real world situation the story was built from. And the film makes a choice here that I think is exactly right, and that explains a great deal about what it was trying to do throughout. It does not choose these title cards to make a political argument. It does not deploy them as an indictment. It deploys them as a completion, as the moment in which the intimate story the film told is placed back inside a larger reality it came from, and in which the audience is asked to hold both simultaneously. The specific phase of Ahmed and the abstract category he belongs to. The one story you felt and the thousands of stories you did not see. This is what the title cards are for. Not information. Most people who came to this film already knew the broad outlines of the interpreter crisis. The title cards are for scale. They are for the moment in which the feeling generated by one specific story is allowed to expand into an awareness of what it represents. They're saying what you felt for Ahmed, feel it again, multiplied by thousands. Because there were thousands, there still are thousands. And the bureaucratic system that the film spent 90 minutes dramatizing has not been fully fixed. The problem did not resolve with the story resolved. The problem continues. That is not the ending of a genre film. That is the ending of a film that was always interested in something larger than its own plot. And the fact that it arrives at that larger interest through such a resolutely intimate story, through the specific texture of two specific men, is the proof of its method. You cannot make someone care about thousands by showing them thousands. You make them care by showing them one. And then you show them the thousands. The foreshadowing in this film, the details that reveal themselves with different meaning on a second viewing, is worth cataloging because they reveal how carefully the story was constructed beneath its surface. The most significant foreshadowing is, of course, the way Ahmed's investment in the IED investigation reads before and after the revelation about his son. On first viewing, his intensity reads as professional commitment, as the thoroughness of a man who takes his work seriously. After the revelation, you see it differently. You see a father. You see someone for whom this mission is not professional at all, but profoundly personal. And then you look back at the ambush and you understand something that the film did not articulate, but that was always true. Ahmed's most powerful motivation for surviving and for carrying Kinley is not loyalty to a colleague. It is the refusal to allow his son's death to have produced nothing. He will not let the mission that his grief built be destroyed by the ambush. He will carry the mission home even if the mission is reduced to the weight of one American soldier. The early scenes in which Kinley watches Ahmed translate also foreshadow the later dynamic in a way that I find quietly beautiful. In those early scenes, Kinley cannot hear what Ahmed is saying. He hears sound, Arabic, Dari Pashto, and relies entirely on Ahmed's interpretation of it. He is, in those moments, completely dependent on Ahmed's mediation of reality. He can only know what Ahmed allows him to know. And this dynamic, the American soldier's epistemic dependence on the Afghan interpreter, is a miniature version of the larger structural relationship the film is exploring. Kinley's survival, his understanding of the environment he is operating in, his ability to function at all in this place, all of it has always been mediated by Ahmed. The film was showing us this dependence from the beginning. We were simply not treating it as such because the institutional context made it seem like a professional service arrangement rather than a fundamental relationship of mutual reliance. There are smaller foreshadowing moments as well. The way Ahmed handles a specific situation in the early operational sequences, the way he makes a unilateral decision that Kinley questions but that turns out to be exactly right, prefigures the survival journey in which Ahmed's autonomous decision making is the only thing standing between Kinley and death. The way Kinley responds to that moment, with initial suspicion that resolves into grudging respect, prefigures his longer arc from institutional reliance to personal commitment. These are not accidental. They are the marks of a screenplay that was made with a structural intelligence that rewards attention. There are no post-credit sequences in this film, and I think that is exactly correct. A post-credit scene would imply that there is something more to say, some additional beat of resolution or humor or setup that exists beyond the story's natural conclusion. This film has nothing left to say after its closing title cards. The title cards are the final beat. The factual weight of the real situation is the last thing the film wants you to carry out of the room with you. A post-credit scene after that would be an act of self-undermining. It would reduce the gravity of the closing statement by suggesting that the film has not yet finished entertaining you. The decision not to include one is a decision about what the film is. It is not entertainment in the light sense. It is experience. And experiences do not have post-credit scenes. My personal emotional reaction to how this film closes is, and I want to be honest here, more personally honest than analysis typically permits, one of the more complex responses I have had to a film in recent memory, because it is not simply moved or satisfied or troubled. It is all of those things simultaneously, and they do not resolve into a single clean feeling. I was moved by the reunion. I was relieved by the abstraction. I was heartbroken by the specific cost I described earlier, and then I was the only word I have for it is weighted, weighted by the title cards, by the numbers, by the reminder that the story ended, but the situation did not. And what I have found in the days and weeks since I first watched this film is that the weight has not fully lifted. It sits somewhere in the body, in the way that honest accounts of honest injustice tend to sit, not loudly, not in a way that interrupts daily life, but present, available, there when you think about it. There when something in the news brings Afghanistan back into view for a day and you find that the feeling the film produced is still accessible, still active, still doing the work that great cinema is supposed to do long after the credits have rolled. That residual weight, that specific quality of a feeling that stays, is the measure of a film's genuine achievement more than any award or box office return. You can forget a film that entertained you. You carry a film that changed something in the way you understand a thing, and The Covenant, for all its imperfections, changed something in me, not dramatically, not in the way of a revelation, but in the quiet, accumulated way of a story that gave a human face to an abstraction I had been carrying as information rather than feeling. I knew about the interpreter crisis before this film. I knew the statistics and the political context and the institutional failures, but knowing is different from seeing, and this film made me feel it. It made it specific. It gave it a name and a face and a history and a sun and a landscape and a distance measured in kilometers carried on one man's back. That is what cinema does when it is working. That is what it is for. There is a practice I have developed over years of watching films closely and thinking about them carefully, a practice that I suspect many of you share without having named it. It is the practice of sitting still after the credits roll, not because there is anything left to see, not because the screen still holds anything, but because the transition from the film's world back to your own world requires a moment of passage that deserves to be honored. You have been somewhere, you have been inside something, and the journey back to your own life, to the room you are in, the sounds of the building, the ordinary persistence of your own existence, is a journey that good films make feel like a return rather than simply a resumption. They made you feel as though something was experienced rather than consumed. And the sitting still is the acknowledgement of that. It is the moment in which the film is permitted to finish its work before you begin the work of analysis. I sat still for a long time after The Covenant. I want to step away from the architecture of critical analysis now, away from the careful examination of craft and the honest accounting of limitation. I want to speak for a few minutes as someone who felt this film rather than someone who studied it, because those are different experiences and both of them deserve their own language. What the film left behind in me was not a single emotion. It was a texture, every specific quality of feeling that I have been trying to find precise words for since the first time I watched it, and that still resists clean articulation in ways that I find more interesting than frustrating. It was something like grief, but not grief for the character specifically, grief rather for the gap between what people do for each other and what institutions do in return. The gap between the weight of a human act and the bureaucratic response to it. The gap between Ahmed carrying a man across mountains and a government processing an application at the speed of administrative convenience. That gap, the specific moral dimension of it, the way it reveals something about how we have organized our collective life that we prefer not to look at directly, that gap is what the film left in me, and it has not closed. I think about Ahmed's face in that moment I described, the moment when the helicopter takes Kinley away and Ahmed is still standing there. I think about it more often than I think about any other single image in this film. Not because it is the most visually striking, not because it contains the most narrative information, but because it holds, in a single human face, in a single unguarded moment, the entire weight of what the film is about. Everything the story has been building toward is visible in that expression, the completion of the act. The cost of it, the uncertainty of what comes next, the specific quality of a person who has done everything they were capable of doing and now exists in the space after that, the space where the act is finished and the consequences have not yet declared themselves. That phase is where I keep returning. And I think the reason I keep returning to it is that it shows me something I recognize, not from my own experience of anything comparable to what Ahmed went through, but from the smaller scale, more ordinary version of that same emotional territory that all of us have visited at some point. The place after typhoid. The place where you have given everything you had and the outcome is no longer in your hands. The specific quality of a person who is finished and waiting and does not know what waiting will produce. Did this film change how I see something? That is the question I always want to answer honestly, because it is the most important question you can ask about a film. Entertainment does not need to change anything, but art, the kind of film that reaches for art, Whatever its imperfections in the reaching art is supposed to do something to your perception. It is supposed to make the world look different from how it looked before you encountered it. Not dramatically different, not transformed beyond recognition, but different in the specific, small, permanent way that genuine understanding produces. What this film changed in me is my relationship to the category of the interpreter. Before this film, I carried that word interpreter in the context of the Afghan war as a piece of factual equipment, a category of person, a political problem, a news story. I knew what it referred to. I understood the injustice of the situation at an intellectual level. I had formed opinions about it, but I had not felt it in the way the film made me feel it. And the distinction between knowing a thing and feeling a thing is, I believe, the most important distinction in the entire vocabulary of human understanding. You can know about suffering and remain at a comfortable distance from it. You can know the statistics on the policy failures and the institutional inadequacies and still hold them at arm's length, still process them as information about a situation rather than as the weight of lives being lived inside that situation. What the film did was make the word interpreter into a face, into a history, into a man with a son who died and a code of honor that outlasted everything that might have destroyed it. And once that word has been given a face, it cannot be returned to the category of abstraction. The face stays, the weight becomes real, and your understanding of the political situation, when you encounter it in the news or in conversation or in the quiet of your own thoughts, is accompanied now by the weight of the particular rather than simply the fact of the general. That is what this film gave me, that is what it left behind. And it is worth naming precisely because it is the kind of gift that imperfect films can still give, the kind that does not depend on the film achieving technical or narrative perfection. It depends only on the film having at its center something true, something located in genuine human experience rather than in narrative convention or genre requirement. And Ahmed as Dar Salim plays him, with the screenplay's honest and carefully built foundation, is something true. He is not a symbol. He is not a representation. He is a specific, complete, imperfectly seen but genuinely attempted human being. And having spent time in his presence, even mediated time, even fictional time, even time spent through the lens of a film that has its share of flaws, I am different for it. Specifically, measurably, permanently different in how I carry the word that describes what he was. Would I return to this film? Yes, with conditions. I would return to it with specific intention, not as casual viewing, not as background entertainment, but as a deliberate choice to sit with it fully again. Because I think there are layers I have not yet fully processed. There are things in the performance Salim gives that I suspect will reveal themselves further on a second and third close watch, in the way that the best screen performances tend to do. There are things in the visual grammar that I want to test against the analytical observations I have made in this essay, to check whether they hold, whether they reveal more, whether I have understood them correctly. I believe I have been fair to this film, but I also believe that it has more in it than any single viewing or any single essay can extract. That it will reward return visits with specific additions rather than simply the comforting familiarity of a film you already know. And that is in the economy of how I decide which films deserve the time of a second watch, a meaningful endorsement. What kind of person will carry this film with them? I have thought about this carefully because it is a question that resists easy demographic categorization. It is not simply a film for people interested in the politics of the Afghan war, though those people will find genuine substance here. It is not simply a film for fans of war cinema, though those viewers will find craft and tactical authenticity and performances worth their attention. It is not simply a film for people who respond to stories about loyalty and debt, though that emotional register is the film's primary frequency. The person who will carry this film most deeply, I think, is the person who has ever stood in the position of owing something that no system around them was designed to acknowledge. The person who has understood from the inside the specific experience of recognizing a debt that exists at the level of the personal and the human, and being unable to find any institutional pathway adequate to discharging it. That experience is not confined to soldiers and interpreters. It lives in smaller, more ordinary versions in many lives. In the relationships where someone did something for you that cannot be repaid, and the impossibility of repayment is its own kind of weight. In the situations where you owe someone your full presence and the world keeps offering you convenient substitutes. In the moments where the easy path and the right path diverge, and you understand in your body that the right path is going to cost more than the easy one, and you stand at that fork and make your choice. Those people, whoever they are, wherever that experience has lived for them, will find something in this film that speaks to them with unusual directness. They will feel recognized by it, and that recognition is the most valuable thing cinema offers. So let us arrive at the complete picture. Let us say honestly and without apology what this film is. Ritchie's The Covenant is a war film that is more interested in obligation than heroism. It is a moral drama that uses the conventions of the thriller to make its argument visceral rather than theoretical. It is a film with one extraordinary performance at its center, one very good performance in close support, and a collection of secondary performances that are competent but underserved by the screenplay's limited investment in its supporting world. It is a film directed with genuine ambition and occasional stylistic overreach, reaching consistently for the register of moral seriousness and landing there more often than its mixed critical reception suggested. It is a film with real pacing problems in its American domestic sections and genuine mastery in its Afghan survival sequences. It is a film whose screenplay contains one of the best constructed character revelations in recent war film memory and several passages of dialogue that feel slightly less than necessary. It is a film with a score that earns its place and a visual language that makes an argument worth making. It is, in other words, a film that is doing something genuinely valuable and doing parts of it very well, while carrying the weight of compromises and missed opportunities that a different production under different pressures or with different creative decisions might have avoided. It is a film made with real conviction about a real injustice by people who cared about getting it right and succeeded imperfectly rather than failing thoroughly. For people who want to feel the moral weight of the Afghan interpreter crisis through a human story rather than a policy analysis, this film is genuinely valuable. For people who want to see Dar Salim in the kind of performance that establishes an actor's claim to the very first rank of working talent, this film is essential. For people who want a war film that asks what the war was for rather than simply what it looked like, this film will give you something to think about long after its final frame. For people who want kinetic genre entertainment without the complications of moral weight, this film will feel slower and more serious than they hoped. For people who want a masterpiece of the form, a film that achieves everything it attempts with the consistency and control of the very best war cinema, this is not quite that film. But it is in conversation with that film. It is reaching toward it, and the reaching is visible and honorable. Who should watch this in a cinema if they still have the chance, and who should seek it on streaming? At the time of this essay, streaming is where it is filmless and where it has found the audience it deserved but did not fully receive in its theatrical run. And I think streaming is perhaps not the worst context for it. It is a film that rewards close attention in a domestic environment more than it needs the scale of a theater screen. Its emotional scale is intimate rather than epic. Its most important moments are the small ones, the faces, the pauses, the moments of physical proximity between two men who have been through something that does not have a language adequate to it. Those moments land in any environment where you are paying genuine attention. They do not require a large screen. They require a quiet room and a willingness to be present with what the film is trying to give you. Find that environment, give it that attention. It will return more than you invest. Is it a film to own? I believe it is. It is the kind of film that will mean more the second time than the first, and more the third time than the second. It is the kind of film that functions differently as you bring different life experiences to it, that will read one way if you watch it at 23 and differently if you watch it again at 35, when the question of what we owe each other has accumulated more personal texture. It is a film that earns a place in a collection not as a showpiece but as a companion. is the thing you return to when the news brings Afghanistan back into view, or when you are thinking about obligation and debt and what it means to honor a promise that no one else can see. It will be there. It will still have weight. These films always do. 6.2 out of 10. That is my honest, considered, completely personal verdict on Guy Ritchie's The Covenant. And the one true sentence that earns it is this: it is a flawed film that tells the truth about something that matters, and the telling of that truth, imperfect, earnest, sometimes overreaching, always sincere, is worth more than the polished execution of a story that has nothing real inside it. A 6.2 is not a dismissal. A 6.2 is a respectful, clear eyed acknowledgement of a film that reaches further than it can fully grasp, and that earns your time by the quality of its reaching. The film wanted to do something important. It did a significant portion of that important thing very well. It fell short in ways that matter and are worth naming. And it left behind, in anyone who watched it with genuine attention, something that will not quickly disappear. Cinema rarely does what this film attempts: takes a political failure and makes it personal, makes it specific, makes it the weight of one face on one day making one choice. And when cinema attempts that and succeeds even partially, even imperfectly, the attempt itself is a form of honor. An honor paid to the people whose real stories live somewhere inside the fiction. An honor paid to the truth that lives underneath the genre. An honor paid to the belief, the stubborn, essential, unreasonable, irreplaceable belief that telling human stories carefully is one of the most important things art can do in a world that tends to process human suffering as category rather than individual, as statistic rather than face, as political problem rather than the specific, irreducible, irreplaceable weight of one particular life. That is what the Covenant tried to do. And the trying matters. It will always matter. Thank you. Genuinely, simply, without ceremony. Thank you for spending this time here. This essay took me to places I did not entirely expect to go when I sat down to write it. That tends to happen with films that have something true in them. They put you past the point where analysis ends and feeling begins, and you find yourself saying things you did not know you were going to say about subjects that are larger than the film itself. I hope that experience came through in everything you have just heard, and I hope, if nothing else, that it sends you or returns you to this film with the quality of attention it deserves and may not always have received. Now I want to hear from you. The comments are where this conversation continues, and there are three questions this film left me sitting with that I genuinely want to know your thoughts on. The first: do you believe Kinley's return to Afghanistan was motivated by genuine personal obligation, or is there an element of guilt and self redemption in it that the film never quite names openly? The second: does the film's structure, splitting its attention between Afghanistan and America, ultimately serve the story or divide its emotional energy in a way that costs it? And the third, the one that has stayed with me most persistently: if the film had been told entirely from Ahmed's perspective, with Kinley as the secondary figure, do you think it would have been a more honest film? Or does the American perspective serve a specific purpose that a purely Ahmed-centered narrative could not have achieved? I have my own thoughts on all three of these questions. I want yours. The next essay on the Cineflex is going to take us somewhere tonally very different from where we have been tonight. We are moving from the moral weight of a war drama into the very different but equally rich territory of a film that uses genre entirely differently. A film about grief and memory and the way the past refuses to stay in the past, made with a visual intelligence that stopped me cold on first viewing. It is a film I have been wanting to talk about for a long time, and the conversation we had here tonight has, strangely, made me more ready to talk about it. Sometimes the film you discuss prepares you for the film you discuss next. Sometimes thinking carefully about one kind of cinema opens a door toward another. I would see you on the other side of that door. If what you experienced here tonight felt like something you want more of, the kind of cinema conversation that takes the art seriously and takes the feeling equally seriously, then you know what to do. Stay with us, subscribe, leave a comment, share this with someone who watches films the way you do. someone who feels them rather than simply watches them. The Cineflux grows through people finding it and finding each other inside it, and every person who arrives here because someone they trusted said you have to hear this makes this space more of what it is meant to be. That is the Cineflux. I will see you in the next one.